The age-old debate, the Glock versus the 1911. This is a continuing debate, or I guess you could call it a squabble or a feud, kind of the old school versus the new school, and the Glock obviously is the stand-in for the new school, even though the Glock design is fairly old. It's like almost 40 years old, somewhere around there at this point. Well, that's pretty new compared to the 1911, which its design is over 100 years old. Goes all the way back to the year 1911. So this is a comparison video of these two types of guns. It really is a comparison of the type. The Glock 17 is the 9mm full-size duty version of this gun, but really all the Glocks are pretty much the same. Like, they have different grip dimensions and slide lengths and barrel lengths, etc. But at the heart of them, they're all pretty much the same. So this is really a stand-in for all the Glock pistols, but we're going to be comparing kind of the flagship models of these two types of guns. Glock 17 is probably the flagship, the 19 also, but I consider the 17 more of a closer comparison to the 1911, which is also a full-size kind of duty gun. The 1911 comes in many calibers as well. However, by far the most common is the 45 ACP. So you can definitely tell the dimensional differences by taking a look at those muzzles. Obviously the 9mm is a smaller diameter projectile, so it has a smaller hole at the end. Just because we want to always make sure that we're doing things safely, I will demonstrate that my guns are empty, no mags in either of them, no rounds in the chamber, don't have any ammo with me. Might seem a little silly, but it's just a good safety habit, and I guess people like to know that they're safe on the other side of the screen. So this is a comparison, particularly looking at it through the lens of defense, like for self-defense. There's lots of different ways to evaluate these two guns, and really, whenever you're talking about evaluations, you're talking about given limited funds. Imagine that you have limited funds, which almost everybody has. How do you decide between, how do you order something in terms of how much you want it, given the amount of money that it costs and given what you want to use that gun for? So this is really going to be through the lens of self-defense. This lens that we're using could also be through the lens of competition. Like, if you're going to use this for competition, our criteria for what would be good or important will be different. You could also look at it through the lens of collectability. Again, that's a different lens. Cool factor is also a different lens. The last two are highly subjective, so it's hard to compare those in terms of things that everybody can agree upon. But defense, we have some metrics that are more useful and less useful to determine if it's good for that. So we'll kind of just go through a little brief history of the two guns. We kind of talked about it already, but the 1911 is a old design. It goes all the way back to around the year 1911 when Mr. John Moses Browning designed this gun. This type of gun really is kind of one of the early movers, and definitely the most successful of the recoil operated handguns. And that basically just means that your gun is opening slightly delayed as opposed to straight blowback. It just means that we have a little bit of a movement of the barrel in some direction to delay the opening and the exposing of the brass from the chamber. That's the simplest version of this, I think. So in that regard, these two pistols are very similar. They're both recoil operated. They just go about it in slightly different ways. But this gun is really the kind of the earliest mover and shaker that really made a huge impact in the world as far as the further designs later on. The Glock is another recoil operated gun. You can definitely see it on this one. When I pull the slide back, you'll see the barrel slightly drop down. And when the barrel is exposed, you can see it's tilted up, kind of looks like it's happy to see you. This is the way in which this gun delays its opening of or exposing of its brass during the firing cycle. That's not really that important to know for the purpose of this. It's just for kind of your own education and understanding a little bit about how these guns are more similar than they are different, really. The Glock has a polymer frame and a steel slide. The Glock design is made by Mr. Gaston Glock back in the, I think, 80s. I'm not exactly sure when this gun came out, but it's been a while for sure. I'm not sure exactly what year it was, but I think 80s is a fairly good decade to remember. So this gun has a polymer frame. This is probably one of its most defining differences. So this part of the gun is made of a polymer, so it is much lighter than the steel frame of most 1911s. So the frame is this piece down here. It's steel on this gun, so it is heavier and arguably more durable. It's hard to compare apples to oranges in this case, but I think most people would agree steel is very durable. It does not have as good of properties against corrosion, for example, but it is more durable against like a dog biting it, for example. I think Yankee Marshall talked about how one of his Glocks got chewed up by a dog. That's not really going to be that big a problem with this type of gun. So, if we were kind of going to describe them in terms of a category, this is a polymer framed gun. This is a steel framed gun. This gun is almost always chambered in 45 ACP. This gun has a significantly different disassembly than the Glock. We won't go into the disassembly, but suffice it to say it is more complicated. Not really like so complicated that it's a huge detriment, but it is absolutely more complicated than the Glock. The 1911 also is a single action only gun. So what that means is when the gun is prepared to fire, the hammer will be back like this, and the trigger performs one function. It drops the hammer. So when I pull the trigger, it drops the hammer. The gun has to be cocked in order for you to fire the gun, meaning the trigger only performs one action. It can't pull itself back and attempt to fire the round without either you manually pulling the hammer back or the racking the slide, or when the gun is firing, it will automatically rack the slide for you. So it's a single action only pistol. It functions very similarly to the Glock in the sense that you don't have second strike capability. You can't, if you pull the trigger and the gun doesn't fire, you can't pull the trigger again without doing something. In the case of the 1911, you have to recock the hammer, or you have to just get rid of your round and move on to the next round. These are just some common things of any single action gun. Single action guns also, by the nature of having a light trigger pull, typically have a manual safety. So this is the manual safety on this gun. It's present on both sides. So what that would look like is for a right-handed shooter, you would manipulate it with your right thumb generally. For a left-handed shooter, you'd be manipulating it with your left thumb. It just means that you have to make sure that your gun is on fire when you attempt to pull the trigger. Gun also has a beaver tail safety, so the grip safety has to be depressed in order for you to fire the gun. If that safety is not depressed, you can't fire the gun. Just means that you have to get a good grip on the gun. If your grip is slightly open, then you won't be able to fire the gun. The Glock, on the other hand, is what we call a striker-fired gun. there is no manual safety on it. There's this little blade on the front here on the trigger. That's not really like a manually depressed safety. Anytime you pull the trigger, you're automatically turning that safety off. Really, it's just to prevent inertia from pulling back on the trigger and pulling the trigger to the rear. It's not really meant to, you can think of it as preventing things from pulling it from the side, but it's really more to prevent inertia from pulling the trigger. The gun kind of is kind of a hybrid of a double action and a single action, which is why we call it a striker fired gun. It doesn't have an external hammer like the single action does. Instead, it has a mechanism inside that it's kind of like it's got a little spring that half cocks itself and is holding itself in half cock. And then when you pull the trigger, it pulls that spring and compresses it even further. And then at the end of the trigger pull, it releases that spring and allows the firing pin to move forward. It's just another way to produce a gun that fires, cartridges. But what ends up happening by doing it that way is you kind of have a kind of double action type pull, where as you're pulling the trigger, you hit kind of some resistance and you pull through it, and then it finally fires. In operation, it functions very similarly to a single action trigger. You don't have second strike capability. Every time you pull the trigger, you get one round down range. That part is very similar. It just has some different mechanisms by which it does its operation. One of the bigger differences between the two is that because it has a kind of double action like trigger, the trigger pull is fairly heavy, certainly heavier than the single action pull of the 1911. And so you can kind of get away with having a gun with no manual safety. So your only safety is the only safety that's on every gun. It's you not pulling the trigger. You keep your finger along the side of the trigger like this, along the frame. The only time you put your finger on the trigger is when you're ready to shoot, just like you do on every gun. However, on this gun, there is no manual safety to activate or deactivate. It's always ready to fire. It is always ready to go. Something else to note on this gun, the Glock 17, so long as you have a Gen 3 or later, you will always have the ability to mount a light onto it. So it's got a rail here, this single slot rail, which this Glock is wearing the TLR1HL. So you always have the option of putting on any sort of device that you want to the end of the gun. This particular 1911 that I'm showing you here is a Springfield loaded, that's the name of it. And it's basically like one step above the base tier. It comes with these front cocking serrations, it comes with some better sights, and it comes with the extended grip safety. But other than that, it's very similar to most other 1911s. It does not have a rail. However, you can get 1911s that have a rail. So that part is just indicative of this particular model of 1911. However, by far, the government style that doesn't have a rail, the government means the mostly the slide length and the barrel length, this configuration, full size. Most 1911s nowadays don't have that rail. However, it's pretty common too, so you could get them either way. It's not like no 1911s have those rails. It's just less common, particularly on the lower priced models of 1911. That's something we can kind of get in kind of as a first thing to think about. Most 1911s are more expensive than the Glocks. So kind of to give you kind of a price point example, Glock 17 Gen 3 in California, most of the time, meaning not right now, but a majority of the time, pre-COVID and all that, you could get these for around $500 to $600. I'd say $550 was the average in our area. I'm sure you could find them for less, but in my area, that's what they usually go for. The Springfield Loaded, when I bought it, it was during COVID times, so I don't really have I don't know exactly what it was pre that. I want to say it was around 900. When I bought it, it was about $975, so it didn't go up a whole lot in price, but suffice it to say, it is more expensive than the Glock offering. However, this is the upgraded model, so it has that beaver tail, which I think is a essential upgrade for most 1911s, this extended swoop right here. It really just helps it be a lot more comfortable. I found that the standard GI grip safety was not comfortable to shoot at all, so I think this is a pretty necessary upgrade. So that's part of why I bought this particular gun. The serrations up here are kind of cool, but not really that important. And the night sights are cool. The sights are cool. You know, the ambidextrous safety is cool. A lot of things on here are just added bonuses for me, but you could get the lower model of this, which doesn't have the extended beaver tail and has some lesser features, I guess, for still a little bit more than the Glock, but pretty close. I think they're like $650. There are also 1911s that are even more budget friendly in kind of the $400 to $500 range, and those ones can be cheaper than the Glock. Sometimes, you know, when you're trying to compare guns, the price can skew how you perceive a gun. So even though the Glock is $600, you know, there are lots of other similar offerings of polymer framed guns that are less money, and the Glock has demanded a price premium, partly just due to the marketability of having a more expensive item. People perceive it as being higher quality. You know, not to say that anything about this is low quality, it's just perhaps higher priced than it needs to be. My point is that price is not it doesn't have a direct relationship to quality or to reliability or utility. So don't think that if you spend twice as much money, you'll get twice as useful or twice as good of a gun. You may not. You typically do. You usually get what you pay for in the gun world, but it is not always a guarantee. So price-wise, I think the Glock definitely has a leg up on the 1911. However, they are not the same gun. So, you know, we're going to come back to this over and over again. They're not built the same. They're not a direct comparison. So it's hard to compare just price based on just price and not think about all the things that go into it. You know, it's a steel gun for the 1911. It's a polymer framed gun for the Glock. You know, how much does it cost to make a polymer frame? Probably next to nothing. Probably like, you know, less than $5 to make this polymer frame. Sure, the technology required, you know, you to plan it out and to do all the manufacturing and tooling for that, but in terms of materials, the Glock is incredibly efficient to produce the frame. So, you know, we're comparing apples to oranges in this regard, but if price was something that is definitely like your thing that you need to consider, the Glock is probably going to be your choice, and you could probably stop it right now as far as just which gun can you afford. Price is definitely going to go for the Glock. When it comes to price, you also want to think about the caliber. So 9mm is generally cheaper to shoot than 45 ACP. You can get these 1911s in 9mm, 40 Smith & Wesson, 10mm, other calibers, but those are the most common for sure. 9mm is available in these, so you could shoot it in this, but by and large, most 1911s are chambered in 45, which is more expensive to shoot. So, you know, when you're picking a gun, don't just don't just look at the sticker price of the gun. You got to plan ahead of time. Okay, how much money am I going to spend supporting this gun, making sure that it runs and doesn't go home hungry. So price, again, succeeds for the Glock. It's in 9mm. But again, those are really just indicative of those calibers. They're not specific to the Glock. If I put any 9mm and 45 ACP gun in front of us, that would be the same. Some place that there is a significant difference is the weight. Because of this polymer frame, you save a significant amount of weight. So the Glock 17 with an empty mag is 24.87 ounces, so 25 ounces. The weight for the 1911, this particular model, as far as the website, as far as Springfield's website goes, says 40 ounces. I don't know if that's with a mag or without a mag, but the mags are usually steel, or aluminum, so they add a little bit of weight, but significantly heavier than 1911 is, right? And that's obvious. It obviously stands to reason, right? You've got the steel frame. You can get 1911s with aluminum frames, and that'll save you a little bit of weight, but the Glock 17 definitely wins in this regard. And this is part of why, a lot of cops really liked, or the departments chose the Glocks for them. Part of it was price, but also the weight. You get a full-size service pistol with a full grip and 17 rounds in the mag to boot, and you save a ton of weight. And weight's a really big deal when you're carrying these around all day. So if you didn't have to carry it around, weight wouldn't be as big of an issue. Like if this was a home defense gun, then actually weight is a benefit for the 1911. But anytime you have to carry it around, less weight is better, up to a point. Shootability goes down as you decrease weight. But again, apples to oranges, right? This is 9mm, this is 45 ACP. This gun has significantly less felt recoil than the 45, even with its heavy frame and all that. So weight, don't want to beat a dead horse. Weight's definitely a plus and a it definitely succeeds. The Glock succeeds in the weight department. And that's probably one of the biggest reasons that people choose the Glock. It's very weight efficient. It carries a lot of rounds for the weight that it has. And probably the next good point is capacity. So as I mentioned, the Glock 17 in its standard capacity magazine holds 17 rounds of 9mm plus one in the chamber. The 1911, if you have a flush fit magazine, you'll hold 7 plus one in the chamber. Most 1911s will come with an extended base pad that will hold 8 rounds for just a little bit extra sticking out the bottom of the gun. So you've got 8 rounds compared, 9 rounds compared to the 18 of the Glock. And that is a significant benefit. You want to remember that, is capacity everything? Well, you can do a lot with 8 rounds of either caliber. Regardless of caliber, 8 rounds is quite a few rounds. Most self-defense encounters are resolved with less than that. But I think it's always better to have the flexibility of having more rounds. Yeah, you don't want to miss in either case, but if you're in a defensive situation, you can definitely guarantee that you're not going to be on your best. You're not going to be the best shot you've ever been. It's probably better to have the ability to hit your target with 18 rounds, at least hit some of them with 18 rounds, than hit less of them and have a lot more options to hit. So, the 1911 loses out in capacity significantly. And, part of that is the caliber, right? So if you make a bullet fatter, it's not going to be able to have as many rounds because of the dimension of the bullets, or the cartridges, if you will. The Glock 17 has a smaller dimension bullet, therefore it's going to generally hold more rounds. That isn't always true. Like for example, if you got a single stack 1911 with holds in 9mm, it's not going to necessarily hold more rounds, maybe a couple more, but you don't nearly double the capacity or anything. It's slightly more size efficient in this gun, but in this gun, man, you get 17 rounds of 9mm. Or 18 rounds. That is a lot of firepower for such a low amount of weight. So I think this is a clear-cut winner of the Glock wins in capacity by a lot. If you're going to be using this for defensive purposes, you also want to remember that they're both guns that are fed from detachable box magazines. So to drop the magazine, you just push on the mag release, mag falls out, you go grab your next mag, slam it in. So in terms of the ability to reload quickly, they both have similar characteristics, but you're going to have to carry like double the magazines to match the round count of the Glock. And if you have one spare mag, you've got 35 rounds. If you have two spare mags, you've only got, let's see, that's 25 rounds. Yeah, 25 rounds versus 35. So, and those mags also, I think, weigh a little bit more. So, if you're planning on carrying this gun, and that's a whole different lens. We talked about, if you're gonna carry it versus you're gonna keep it at home. We'll just kind of briefly touch on both. The Glock is definitely gonna win in the carry department, right? The 1911 has perhaps one advantage in that it is slightly thinner in the slide. So hopefully you can see that. Thinness of the slide is a dimension that is important in concealed carry if you're going to be carrying inside the waistband. The Glock is a little thicker, it's a little bulkier. The 1911 has a benefit in that regard, but in just about every other regard, it's not succeeding as far as the ease of carrying. Let's kind of, we've been bashing a lot on the 1911. Let's talk about something that the 1911 is better at. And I think this is, for me, really the only characteristic that I think is a significant benefit, and that is the trigger. So what does a trigger do? A trigger is your ability to interface with the gun to tell it to fire a round. Now that might seem kind of simple, but it's actually a little more complicated than you might think. You're the human, right? So you're the factor that is really a wild card. Every human is different, and this trigger is basically the same. No matter who you put on the trigger does the same job. No matter who's pulling this trigger, the trigger does the same thing regardless. And my point with that is that I think that the 1911 trigger is far more forgivable of the human being not very good at their marksmanship, let's say. It is true that it has more recoil than the Glock. However, it is far easier to get a nice precise shot when you have a nice little short take up and then just a little bit of weight to fire the gun. Versus any gun that has a lot of travel, so movement between where the trigger is at rest, and see all that take up, and then I hit some resistance, take up, resistance, and then I kind of have this little spongy section, and then it breaks. Anytime you add in stages or resistance that doesn't just build up and then break immediately, it makes it a little bit harder to shoot that gun accurately. I want to give the Glock its fair shake in that if we're talking about self-defense for civilians, for example, it probably won't really matter, that extra ability to be accurate with the trigger. you're probably not going to need that extra accuracy. However, you might. And this is an area that I think a lot of 1911 owners who really like the 1911 justify it by. A lot of people just are much more accurate with shooting one of these guns, meaning it's not that the gun is necessarily more accurate. Both these guns are plenty accurate for most people's hands. However, the ability to easily connect with your target where you want to, that is an area where the 1911 shines. And it's due to the simplicity and design of the trigger. The trigger has these little arms that push back on a piece back here. And so it's pretty much a straight back, you hit resistance, just the slightest bit of take up, I'm hitting resistance, and then I apply, up to like 5 pounds of pressure or whatever it is. And I get that nice clean trigger break. On the Glock, I have some take up, and then I have some kind of undefined sponginess that I pull through. Now, I can shoot this gun pretty darn well. However, I think empirically it is a less good trigger. And the goodness of the trigger is not just subjective. I like the feel of this trigger, or I like the feel of this trigger. I think the amount of error that you can make happen on a gun is larger if there's more travel, and it's larger if it's heavier, meaning the trigger weight is heavier. I'm not saying that's the case in these guns. I think they're actually pretty darn close in terms of weight of the triggers, but the lack of movement of the 1911's trigger definitely aids in how easy it is to connect with your target. So that is an area that I think the 1911 has an advantage in. I'm hesitant to say it's a significant advantage because in the realm of defense, again, all these, both of these triggers are perfectly adequate for that purpose. I think as a kind of a good segue for this is that the downside of having that nice trigger is that it is very easy to pull the trigger, right? It's very easy to get that nice, perfect, crisp shot. However, it also is very easy to accidentally pull the trigger. So on such a light single action gun, it's pretty much a necessity to have your gun on safe when you're not shooting, because it's so easy that if you accidentally slip in there, it's pretty easy to accidentally pull that trigger. So the trigger necessitates having some extra level of safety for you. In this case, 2 safeties. You've got the grip safety, which is not really a safety in the sense of you have to turn it on and off. If you're grabbing the gun, it is off. The manual safety is really what we're talking about here. Now the manual safety, because it stops the trigger from firing, you have to remember to turn the safety off when you want to fire the gun. So this is an area that a lot of people really like the Glock for, and I'm inclined to agree. You have a simpler gun with the Glock. All you have to do is pull the gun out of the holster, your gun is ready to fire. There is no manual safety to adjust, there's nothing to do except to pull the trigger. On the 1911, you have one extra step. Assuming that your gun is cocked and locked and chambered and all that, which in my opinion it should be, but only if you're prepared to use the level of safety that is required of that, which I think most people should train to that level. If you're not, I don't know what you're doing carrying a gun, you should train to get better. So let's say you've got your gun cocked and locked. That means that you've got a round in the chamber, your hammer is back, and your safety is on. That's cocked and locked. That's the way you would carry your gun. When you pull it out of your holster, you got to remember to swipe that safety off when you're ready to shoot, and you have to remember to put that safety back on when you're not shooting. So this goes against the principle of simplicity. When your life is on the line, as I said before, your ability to hit your target is going to decrease significantly. Additionally, anytime you add on extra steps to your process for getting your gun ready and out and to be able to use it, even just one step adds a significant detriment to simplicity. The perfect way to have it is to have it all ready to go. All you have to do is pull the trigger. There's no extra step for, our little reptile brain to have to remember through a crisis. We don't want to have to remember to do any little things during a crisis, So this is one area that the Glock definitely shines in. And I don't think there's really any way around that for the 1911. The benefit of the single action trigger necessitates having that safety. The super light, very easy to shoot crisp trigger needs a safety to work together to make sure that you don't accidentally fire this gun. The Glock kind of does a halfway measure between having a really heavy double action pull and having a light single action. It's kind of a halfway measure. It's not a light single action pull like this gun, and it definitely has travel, but it's not as heavy as a true double action only gun. So it kind of splices that. It's a hybrid, and I think it strikes a pretty nice medium. I could definitely see somebody who's careless pulling this trigger on accident, but it's got enough travel that you're probably not gonna inadvertently pull it in most cases. However, I'm sure that many people do. It's, if bad trigger discipline is really the culprit for most accidental discharges, and hopefully that your gun was pointing in a safe direction. So always follow the safety rules. Those are there for a reason. Durability. I think durability on both these guns is pretty darn close. I think that, it's hard to measure durability as far as how much use can they have before I need to replace something. I really don't have a metric on that. I think most guns are pretty similar in that regard. Some are certainly worse, but I think most good designs are pretty much in the same realm of your springs might wear out here and there, but generally they're all going to be pretty durable. They're certainly durable enough that most of us are never going to shoot out our guns for the most part, unless you're a competitor, or unless you really dedicate a lot of time to your defensive firearms practice, in which case that's great. You're probably not the one who needs help in this area or is interested in this area. So I would say durability is pretty much a wash for both. If your gun ever has a problem, you can replace all the parts on it pretty easily. The only exception is the frame. I think in that regard, the Glock is a little better because it's really easy to replace one of these versus to replace a frame on a 1911 is more parts. And if your 1911 is very tuned, for example, this gun is probably not an example of this, but the 1911 is less forgiving in terms of drop-in parts. So some of these parts are, fitted to work together. Whereas the Glock, I don't think any part of this really is fitted to work with a particular other part. The barrels are drop-in, the slide, that's really the two areas where I would ever think there's a fitting requirement. I guess the sights, you can fit these rear sights a little bit if you want to, but the Glock is much more forgiving of replacing parts. The 1911, despite that, I still think it's pretty close in durability. For me, I'm always just thinking what is the average person going to use? Is the average person going to run into a durability problem with one of these guns? I think even if you only bought one of these guns and no other guns and only shot these guns for your entire life, I think it's pretty unlikely most people are going to run into any bad durability problems that aren't fixed by just replacing a small spring here and there. So I think that's kind of a wash in that regard. Here's kind of a fun one, cool factor. I think that, for me, I think that the 1911 has more of a cool factor, and that's, it's totally a subjective thing. I think that if somebody went to the range and I didn't know what they were going to bring, if they bring a Glock, I'm going to say, oh, okay, nice Glock, you know, good choice. If somebody goes to the range and brings a nice 1911, I'd say, oh, look at you. You chose a 1911. That's pretty cool. Even if you had kind of cool Gucci Glock with, you know, lightning cuts on the slide and stipple jobs, and you've replaced every part on that gun. I personally don't think those are very, like, they don't have a lot of cool factor for me. To me, they just are like a fun thing you can do, but they don't get me excited. I think a 1911 that is really, particularly a beautifully blued 1911, like old Colts and stuff, those get me excited. Stainless guns, they're okay, but I think a beautiful blued 1911 is awesome. I think these guns have a little more cool factor for me, but that doesn't mean anything for anyone else. So for me, I like these as far as cool factor goes, but I think I would, you know, based on all those other things, if this was a range toy for them, I'd say awesome, great. But if it was like their one gun and they're going to be using this as their defensive gun, I would probably think to myself, you know, you're kind of getting into the meme territory of, yeah, you could use this as your defensive gun, but like you've got so many benefits with the Glock: the weight, the capacity, the simplicity, the ease of cleaning, which we haven't really talked about, but you know, those are all, the Glock has a lot going for it in terms of utility, like strict utilitarianness. But I gotta say, cool factor, I think, goes to the 1911. The next, you know, we can move on to this. One of these last points is care. How do you care for these guns? Well, the Glock is, I think, pretty notoriously, let's say, like easy to clean and easy to care for. It doesn't have a whole lot that needs to be kept up on. You know, you've got your extractor that needs to be cleaned periodically, and you've got to make sure you clean out the you know, the carbon that builds up. But you know, people really don't clean their Glocks very much, and it is a gun that is very resilient to neglect and abuse in that regard. You can shoot a lot of rounds through these and you're not going to notice much in reliability detriments. You might notice some faster wearing of your parts, but the gun should still work well past where I would normally want to clean my guns. I don't think that is the same for the 1911. The 1911 is a metal on metal frame to slide fit, and it is, you know, it needs to be more oiled. It needs to be more meticulously cared for. I think that it would probably still run longer than, you know, you would worry about it. Like, let's say you didn't get to clean your gun for a long time. Let's say you shot, you know, 200 rounds, 400 rounds. I think it'll probably still do fine so long as you can clean it after that 400 rounds. I would still say that's pretty far down where you're already getting into lapping. You know, your carbon is building up with oil in your gun, and it's starting to lapping your metal. I would say that's probably not a good thing. I would want you to clean it more frequently. However, I think this gun is going to encounter reliability issues way faster due to not cleaning it than the Glock will. And I think it's also far more susceptible to like that wearing than is the Glock. You know, the lapping of, you know, having carbon build up and mixing with oil and lapping your gun and lapping your rails and doing all that. I think this gun is far more susceptible to it than the Glock. So that's an area that the Glock definitely has an advantage in. And we talked about a takedown of the gun. The 1911 is definitely more challenging. I think that's pretty much everything I had to cover. So is there a conclusion to this? Well, you know, we talked about through the lens of defense, right? Should I buy one or the other? Well, I think the obvious choice is that I would say buy both if you have the funds. However, if you're limited to having one gun that has to do more, that has to do everything, that has to be utilitarian in the strictest sense, it has to strictly be utility, it has to do as much as it can possibly do, I think that the Glock is the clear winner. I don't think there's really any way around that. I think the only argument I could make for myself, to myself, I'm not really trying to convince you, you guys can make your own decisions on this. For me, when I'm deciding, like, do I want to carry a 1911? It pretty much has negatives in every single category, with the exception of the ability to hit your target really well. I think this gun is easier to shoot accurately. That doesn't mean that I can't get very acceptable accuracy to myself, at 5 yards, 7 yards. I think that they both perform perfectly fine at that distance. However, as soon as I push the range out, I think that this gun is easier to hit with at a range, just because of that nicer trigger. However, for me, it just can't make up for all those shortcomings. The weight, the capacity, the simplicity. I don't want to have to remember to turn the safety off. And really, those are really they all add up to me choosing the Glock in almost every situation, except if I just want to show off a cool gun and fondle my gun or show people the gun. But again, that's not for the purpose of defense. This gun, unfortunately, it just has been outshined in too many areas by other designs. And this gun is certainly not even a particularly modern gun. It's getting up there. It's like almost 40 years old at this point. However, it's still kicking. It's still holding its own, just like the 1911 still holds its own as far as it can do everything that we talked about. It can be a carry gun. It can protect you, no doubt. You could probably protect yourself with pepper spray too. However, we're just talking about kind of ideals and just, trying to create some ways in which we can think about these guns. So I hope this has been helpful for you and hopefully a little fun. And, this is kind of one of the quintessential meme arguments in gun world. It's not so much that there is even really a competition between the two of them, because I think the Glock is clearly a more utilitarian gun. It does so much more better than the 1911. However, people really love that cool factor. They are really drawn to the cool factor of this gun, and I totally get it. I totally understand that. However, at this point in my life, I am more utilitarian than interested in cool factor. So the Glock is my choice for that regard. So hope this is helpful for you, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.